Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most consequential questions of the ongoing war. What happens next after Ukraine destroys Russia's land bridge to Crimea? This is more than a simple military strike or an isolated event. It's a potential turning point that could reshape the entire balance of power in the region. The destruction or severe disruption of the land bridge would carry vast military, political, and strategic consequences for both sides. To understand what might happen next, we need to look closely at what this land bridge really means, why it matters so much to Russia, and how Ukraine could use its destruction to shift the war's momentum in its favor. The so-called land bridge to Crimea refers to the network of roads, railways, and supply routes that connect mainland Russia through occupied territories in southern Ukraine to the Crimean Peninsula. Since the full-scale invasion in 2022, Russia has relied heavily on this route to move troops, weapons, and supplies between Crimea and its forces in southern Ukraine. For Russia, it's not just a matter of convenience, it's a lifeline. The Kerch Strait Bridge, which links Crimea directly to Russia, has already been attacked multiple times, and each strike has proven how vulnerable Moscow's logistics can be. Without this overland route, the Russian military would face enormous difficulties maintaining its occupation of Crimea and sustaining any major operations in the south. If Ukraine were to fully destroy this land bridge, the immediate result would be a major logistical crisis for the Russian army. Supplies that once moved freely from Russia to Crimea would suddenly be cut off or forced onto much longer and riskier routes. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and reinforcements would become harder to deliver. Every truck and train would have to go farther, through less secure areas, under constant threat from Ukrainian drones, missiles, and partisans. This would dramatically slow down Russia's war machine, forcing it to adapt quickly or risk losing ground in multiple sectors. For the first time in years, Russia's entire southern front could become isolated and vulnerable. Ukraine, on the other hand, would gain a crucial strategic advantage. Severing the land bridge wouldn't just be a symbolic victory. It would be a tangible shift in battlefield dynamics. With Russia's logistics in chaos, Ukrainian forces could intensify their pressure along the southern front, particularly toward Melitopol, Mariupol, and even into Crimea itself. The ability to isolate Russian forces in the peninsula could open the door to future offensives aimed at retaking more territory or forcing Moscow to negotiate from a weaker position. It would also boost morale across Ukraine and among its allies, showing that Ukrainian strategy, resilience, and Western-backed precision strikes can achieve major, lasting results. But it's important to understand that destroying the land bridge doesn't instantly end the war. Russia still has alternative routes, though less efficient ones, such as sea transport across the Black Sea or air supply missions. These methods are slower, more expensive, and far more vulnerable to attack, but they can partially sustain Russia's military presence for a while. Moscow has shown remarkable determination in repairing damaged infrastructure, as seen with the Kerch Bridge repairs, even under constant threat. So, while Ukraine's success in disrupting the land bridge would deal a heavy blow, it would mark the beginning of a new phase rather than the end of the conflict. In the aftermath of such a strike, Russia's first move would likely be damage control. It would attempt to repair sections of the bridge and supply lines as quickly as possible, using engineering units and even civilian contractors under military protection. Simultaneously, it would step up air defense coverage in the south, deploying additional systems to protect whatever remains of its logistical arteries. Russia would probably also increase its attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure in retaliation, striking power grids, railways, and supply hubs to even the score. These escalations could lead to a new phase of the war, characterized by constant strikes and counter-strikes, where infrastructure rather than territory becomes the primary target. Politically, the destruction of the land bridge would carry enormous symbolic weight. For Ukraine, it would confirm its ability to reach deep into occupied territory and dismantle key components of Russia's war effort. Such a success would reinforce public confidence in the government and military, giving Ukrainians renewed hope that victory is possible. Internationally, it would strengthen Kyiv's hand in securing more military aid and political backing. Western partners who have sometimes questioned whether Ukraine can achieve major breakthroughs would have concrete proof that their support makes a difference. In the United States and Europe, this could translate into faster approval of weapons deliveries and greater willingness to supply long-range missiles, air defense systems, and naval capabilities. For Russia, on the other hand, the psychological and political damage could be severe. The Kremlin has long portrayed Crimea as an inseparable part of Russia, a sacred symbol of national pride. The idea that its connection to the mainland could be severed would strike at the heart of that narrative. Russian citizens who have been told that the war is going according to plan might start to question that belief. The loss or isolation of the land bridge could lead to unrest among pro-war factions, criticism from nationalists, and growing frustration among ordinary Russians as the costs of the war keep rising. It might not immediately destabilize Vladimir Putin's government, but it would definitely shake the image of total control that the regime tries to project. The international community would watch this situation with great interest and concern. NATO members would likely interpret the event as proof that Ukraine's long-range strike capability can change the battlefield equation. This could encourage more robust cooperation between Ukraine and Western militaries, possibly including the sharing of intelligence or training for advanced weapons systems. At the same time, some countries might worry about Russian retaliation or escalation, particularly if Moscow feels cornered. Russia has already hinted at nuclear rhetoric in the past when facing setbacks, and while most experts consider it unlikely that such weapons would actually be used, the threat itself would raise tensions and complicate global diplomacy. For Crimea itself, the loss of the land bridge would have immediate and profound effects. The peninsula, already heavily militarized, relies on that connection for a huge portion of its supplies, everything from food and fuel to construction materials and military equipment. If those supplies slow to a trickle, the daily lives of civilians and soldiers alike would become harder. Prices would soar, fuel shortages would appear, and the region's economy would start to suffocate. The Russian military bases there, including naval installations and airfields, would face major operational limits. Without steady resupply, their ability to launch sorties or maintain readiness would decline, making them more exposed to Ukrainian attacks. Essentially, Crimea could turn into a logistical trap for Russia, expensive to defend and impossible to fully secure. Ukraine could then intensify its strategy of attrition. With Russia's southern logistics crippled, Kiev would have the opportunity to strike deeper into Crimea using long-range missiles, drones, and special operations. Each strike would compound Russia's difficulties, forcing it to allocate even more resources to defense instead of offense. Over time, this could wear down Russia's will to fight and make its presence in Crimea unsustainable. The ultimate goal for Ukraine might not be a direct invasion of Crimea, which would be extremely costly and dangerous, but rather to make the peninsula untenable for Russian forces until they are forced to withdraw or negotiate their exit. Yet this scenario also brings new risks. A wounded Russia is not necessarily a weaker or less dangerous one. Historically, when facing major setbacks, Moscow often responds with escalation. That could mean intensified missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, or attempts to open new fronts elsewhere, perhaps along Ukraine's northern border. Russia could also increase its hybrid warfare efforts abroad. Disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and attempts to destabilize pro-Ukrainian governments in Europe. These actions would be meant to distract, divide, and demoralize Ukraine's allies. The West would need to be ready for that kind of retaliation, keeping its unity intact and ensuring that Ukraine continues to receive the support it needs. From a military standpoint, Ukraine's next steps would require careful balance. Destroying the land bridge would be a major success, but maintaining momentum afterward would be even more important. Ukraine would need to secure the gains made, protect the areas around its southern offensive zones, and prevent Russia from regrouping. This means building fortified positions, continuing intelligence and drone operations, and making sure supply lines to Ukrainian forces remain uninterrupted. Logistics wins wars, and Ukraine would need to make sure that its own logistics stay as strong as possible while Russia's falter. Western support will play a huge role here, particularly in providing precision weapons, air defenses, and continued financial assistance. Economically, the fallout from such a strike would also reverberate beyond the battlefield. Russia would face huge costs in rebuilding or replacing the damaged infrastructure. Insurance and trade through the Black Sea would become even riskier, potentially raising shipping costs and disrupting global grain exports once again. Ukraine, which depends on grain trade for its economy, could benefit from improved control over parts of the Black Sea if Russia's naval power weakens. This could help Kiev reopen safer shipping lanes and rebuild some of its economic capacity even during wartime. The global markets would react strongly to these developments, especially in energy and food prices, as uncertainty spreads about how Russia might respond. Diplomatically, the destruction of the land bridge could shift negotiations if talks resume. Ukraine would approach any potential dialogue from a much stronger position, armed with the fact that it has successfully undermined one of Russia's most strategic advantages. Russia, meanwhile, would likely try to stall or seek ceasefire conditions that allow it time to recover. The question for both sides would be whether this moment becomes a stepping stone toward eventual peace talks or the start of an even more intense cycle of escalation. Much would depend on how far Ukraine and its allies want to push, and how far Russia is willing to go to preserve its hold on Crimea. Over the following months, analysts would be watching closely for signs of adaptation. Would Russia succeed in establishing new supply chains by sea? Would Ukraine continue its strikes to prevent reconstruction? How fast could either side move forces to exploit or counter the situation? The answers to these questions would determine whether the destruction of the land bridge marks a true turning point or just another stage in a long and grinding war. What's clear is that logistics and infrastructure have become the central battleground. This war, more than any other in recent history, shows that power doesn't just depend on soldiers or tanks. It depends on the ability to move, supply, and sustain them. Looking further ahead, this event would also reshape military thinking worldwide. Nations observing the conflict are learning that infrastructure, bridges, railways, fuel depots, and communication lines can be as decisive as front-line combat. The Ukrainian attacks on Russian logistics highlight the growing importance of drones, cyber warfare, and long-range precision strikes. Future conflicts will likely focus even more on cutting supply lines and isolating opponents rather than direct mass confrontations. The lessons of the destroyed land bridge will influence military doctrines in NATO, China, and beyond for years to come. For ordinary Ukrainians, the emotional impact of such a victory would be immense. After years of suffering and resilience, seeing a critical Russian link collapse would be a powerful symbol of justice and resistance. It would remind them that even a smaller nation, when determined and united, can challenge and weaken a much larger aggressor. For Russian citizens, the message would be more complex. Many would question why their government cannot protect what it claims is Russian territory. As body bags continue to return home and the war drags on without clear victories, public discontent could rise, even if the Kremlin tries to suppress it. Ultimately, the destruction of Russia's land bridge to Crimea would represent both a victory and a new challenge for Ukraine. It would change the shape of the war but not end it. The next phase would demand even greater endurance, coordination, and international backing. Russia would adapt, strike back, and attempt to rebuild. Ukraine would need to stay flexible, ready to exploit every weakness while protecting its own people and infrastructure. The world would watch closely, understanding that the stakes extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. The struggle over Crimea's connection to Russia is about more than territory. It's about the future of international law, security, and the principle that borders cannot be changed by force. As we move into this next stage of the conflict, one thing is certain: the outcome will depend not only on weapons and tactics, but on endurance, unity, and willpower. Ukraine has shown it can adapt, survive, and strike where it matters most. If it continues to receive the support it needs, the severing of the land bridge could be remembered as the beginning of the end for Russia's occupation in the south. But if complacency sets in, or if the world's attention shifts elsewhere, the moment could pass and Russia could rebuild what was lost. History will be written by how both sides respond to this turning point. Thank you for watching and staying informed. If you found this analysis useful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the biggest global developments shaping our future. Let's continue to follow this story closely, because what happens after the destruction of the land bridge will define not just the war in Ukraine, but the balance of power in Europe for decades to come.